shows the different points where Paul made one journey. It's a typical route that boats would follow. Not maybe the largest of vessels, but most of the ones who'd be transporting things. They don't go way out in the ocean as much as they skip along the land and venture along. And so when you come over to where that large yellow arrow is pointing in where Corinth is, you can see it would be advantageous to have a little pathway right through there to get to the opposite side, heading towards Spain, just up from the Grecian area. Corinth was right there on that spot where a lot of times the cargo would be dropped off and carried across that little area and then picked up in another boat and carried on. Discussions made much later about digging a canal. I don't know of all the details of that, how that ever turned out, but the point is that if you have so much influx of things going on, you've got a pretty metropolitan area. Now, it's a Greek area culture-wise, so it's very prominent with, next slide there, the Grecian influence, both the philosophical and the arts and the cultures. The impact has been going on far before the time of Christ and before Paul ever even lived on this earth. Next slide. Influence of economy and also the religious influence is a strong thing within that area. And so it's a very prominent spot for a church to be planted if you could do such, considering the fact because of the religious influence, you're looking at not religious in the sense that we would look at as much as there's lots of different gods that they believed in. So you've got to work against that, but religious in another sense, that'd be maybe open at least to hearing what your religion has to do. And so lots of debate and discussions have gone on in the process of this. Now, Paul went on his missionary journey and stopped off in Corinth. Chapter 18, right? 1 Corinthians? Verses 1 through 11. And, Acts 18, 1 through 11. And the discussion talks about, in verse 2, he finds a Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because of Claudius having commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, and so he comes to them. So because of them having the same trade, it says here in verse 3, and you find a little later in that verse that they were tent makers, Paul and Aquila and Priscilla became friends. There was a tremendous amount of influence that this couple will have in the church, eventually discussed in chapter 19. But the church is being started because of this missionary journey that Paul has along with Aquila and Priscilla. And they will stay there, Paul will actually, a year and a half in working in that area. There was some persecution, there was a lot of struggles that are discussed in the book of Acts that Paul has to deal with, but just for the fact of thinking of the great apostle Paul staying a year and a half in such a prominent area, such a very affluent area, you've got a tremendous amount of potential for what could come about. And so that's what we see on the Corinthian church. The Corinthian church had a lot of fame because of the influence of the area and because of the spiritual gifts that they'll have. But the Corinthian church had a lot of problems too. Go ahead to the next slide. There you go. Number one was division. Chapters 1, 2, and even chapter 3, as far as that goes. The division that was taking place in Corinth. Paul talks about that, particularly in verse 11. He said, "It's become declared to me concerning you, my brethren, by those of Chloe's household," some people that came from that household that visited with Paul, "that there are contentions," he uses the word, "among you." But basically he describes it as division. Verse 12, he said, "I say this, that each of you says, I'm of Paul, or I'm of Apollos, or I'm of Cephas, or I'm of Christ." And he goes on to talk about the question that obviously the answer is no. Is Christ divided? No. Was Paul crucified for you? No. Were you baptized in the name of Paul? No. And so there was a problem with division within the church. In addition to that, there was an issue of immaturity. Relates to a variety of different things, but as we're looking at the problems within the Corinthian church, and I'm looking at it as an overall thing to start with here, the immaturity had an influence on what they were capable of doing. They're a very fluid area. Probably a lot of prominent people were converted. They were given spiritual gifts on top of that, miraculous gifts we're talking about. And yet, because of the immaturity that they had as far as what to do with all of those things, it became a problem for them. And so immaturity was an additional problem related to their worldliness. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, immorality was another problem within the church. In chapter 5 of 1 Corinthians, Paul starts it out by saying, it's actually reported among you that there's sexual immorality among you, that of such as sexual immorality that is not even named among the Gentiles. He doesn't go any further in detail. He doesn't want to. They know what's happening. Paul's heard about it, and that's bad. So much so that the Gentiles aren't even doing that. Now, in the Corinthian area, history tells us that there was one pagan temple to Aphrodite that had 1,000 temple prostitutes. That is, in other words, part of their worship was to go up and worship at that site, to worship Aphrodite, and engage in sexual immorality, and that was part of your worship principle. I'm not sure the following they had, but I'm guessing with 1,000 prostitutes there, they had pretty large following. And you're dealing with a lot of immorality in the area on how we would look at it, although they would call it religion. But something was happening within the church. It was even beyond that. And so Paul addresses that issue. They had brethren issues. Chapter 6, Paul talks about a brother going against another brother in a law court, suing somebody. And the fact is that not only were they doing it, but they were doing it in front of people that weren't members of the church. And it was dragging the name of the church in front of a lot of people. In chapters 12, 13, and 14, in addition, after that, next one, misuse of spiritual gifts. It was a great thing for them to have these spiritual gifts. Abilities to heal, abilities to speak in different languages, not only to communicate to the people, but those that translated for them would demonstrate that they had God's power with them. Gifts of healing and so many things that they were capable of doing, and yet it became a bragging issue. My gift's better than your gift. And tongue speaking, for whatever purpose was in that day and time, seemed to be the ultimate gift in their mind. And instead of using it for instruction for the brethren, which is what it was given for, they began using it as a wedge. And Paul talked about it in chapter 3, but he comes back at it in chapters 12, 13, and 14 on this whole issue of what God is up to in this process when he gave them these gifts. And so as we're looking at all the different things that are going on, the church had a great potential, and yet they had a lot of problems that they had to deal with. Give me the next slide, if you would, Chad. As we're looking at the whole thing here, the focus really is the body. I know we could break down the several points of different things that went on, including some of the things we talked about, problems of misunderstanding as far as the purpose of the Lord's Supper, discussed in chapters 10 and 11 and all, but this whole thing, when it comes down to it, all points to missing the focus, which is the body. And so, as you're looking at what's happening, next slide here, we've got, well, back up. Sorry, go back to that one. We have that quick. You have all of these different things that are mentioned within this vast letter. And each one of these things is telling us not only is it a sin in of itself, the immorality, the division, the brother suing a brother, and naming all these things, but every bit of it was harming the body in one way or another. The immorality was dragging the whole church down as people were bragging about it, as if that was something to achieve. The division kept the church from producing what it ought to do. And so as we're looking at this entire letter as a whole, the focus is the body. Now give me the next slide here. One more. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, 18 times the phrase the body is mentioned, just in one chapter. As Paul is moving through this entire letter, he's building up, I think, to get to this case of the importance of the church, the body. He'll say in chapter 12 that God's purpose in this whole thing, in chapter 12, verse 18, was that the body would be one. He made it that way just as he was pleased to do so. God set this in motion. This is not an accident. Our democracy, you could say, was somewhat of an accident. I know it was intentional, the focus of how everything was put together in this country we live in. People planned and devised and all that. But it was something that kind of came along through a process of time. Whereas the Corinthian church was not developed because of the thinking of men, but rather the planning of God Almighty. That the product of the church itself was something that God had in mind. And so he talks about it having many members, but one body. He'll go along and he'll talk about that there should be no division, verse 25, in the body. In verse 24, he talks about these parts that seem to have lesser of an honor are going to be given greater honor. In verses 21 and 22, he'll say that the eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. Or this one can't say to the other, I don't need you, because I'm better than you are. But rather, each one of us needs each other. On the flip side of that, those that feel rather insecure or insignificant don't need to say, well, I'm not important enough, so therefore I really don't have a place in the body. But rather, he says, you do have. And so it keeps coming back to the emphasis of what the body's about. It's interesting how God uses that term as we can look at it physically and fully understand how our body needs every part. Obviously, there's some parts in our body that don't function as well, maybe, as it did for those of us that are a bit older than we used to be. Our eyesight might be fading. Our knees might be weakening, or a variety of different things. But you see, every part of the body keeps on functioning and working together to allow us to keep doing what we hope to do, what the head guides us to do. Christ being the head of the church, described as the body, not only here, but in the 1 Corinthian letter, the Ephesian letter, represents exactly what God is after. That he purposely, as we look around and we see in this assembly, any assembly, around the world, whichever it is, that there's a variety of different people. Just like you look at any human being and there's a variety of different parts in every human being. We can comprehend one, and God says, I want you to take that visual example that you have and realize this is exactly what I intended for the church to do, to function together, to work together. Next slide. You see, as we're looking at what's going on, the 1 Corinthians 13 chapter a lot of times gets separated from what we look at here within the scope of the letter. And yet, Paul is instructing the church to do exactly what they've been missing. And so as he talks about, for instance, the spiritual gifts in chapter 12, and he leads into it in chapter 13, he says, if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, like those that had those big gifts, but I have not love, I'm just making a bunch of racket. I'm a sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And then he describes another gift. If I have the gift of prophecy, you see, and he goes on and talks about, and I can describe all knowledge, but I don't have this, then it does anything. If I give my body, and those that have the gift of giving, to be burned, but it doesn't help the body, I'm missing it. So all that he's saying here is, the instruction is, everything that God has designed within the church is designed not only to strengthen ourselves as individuals, but the purpose is to strengthen each other in the body itself. That term, edifying the body, that's mentioned in chapter 14, that instructional part, literally is the same term, edifying, that is used in describing construction, where you lay one brick on top of another. And you take it a row at a time. You add a brick at a time. And you work through the process. And as God is talking about all of this within the Corinthian letter, he's talking about the importance of the church. When we look to build our congregation, it starts on an individual basis. We talk about trying to establish a stronger leadership. But it's not just there. We're looking to add a couple elders to the central congregation in the next few weeks. But it's not just there. It's not just a person who can stand up in front of somebody and speak or lead singing or a prayer or read a scripture. But it's all the things that we do that make us who we are. Quite often, some of you may have heard me visiting here or heard me over say to visitors, but I will talk about the strength of our congregation. I'll talk about the singing is good and this is good. I said, and I'll say the preaching's so-so. They don't know if I'm the preacher or not maybe when they first meet me. And I don't care. And I said, but let me tell you what our strength is. We stand together. We work together. This congregation understands what we're about. Now, individually, we miss it sometimes because we're human beings, you see. But the instruction that Paul is giving us here is that here's where it all comes together on who we are. We discussed hopes of being a lighthouse to this downtown community. With connections to the Student Center, we discussed trying to reach out on this campus. And a lot of the students are pushing me occasionally to think about what can we do down here. I was talking with Caleb back just a week or so ago, and he said, what can we do to reach out more to the downtown area? And I said, that's some good thinking. I appreciate the fact that they're not thinking just about themselves as an individual unit, but we're a church. We work together. And God's intending for that in order to make things actually happen. We're blessed by that too when you look at what's going on. That as we consider this, and we've discussed this, and we've worked about this for a long time, I believe we're developing what God wants us to be. Still working to make ourselves stronger. But when we go through this letter, and I encourage you just to go back and spend a little time in chapter 1 and 2, mentioning what I talked about as far as knowing God. I want you to also focus on reading a chapter from one of the Psalms each day this week, along with other things that you might be reading and studying from God's Word. But just adding a little bit to it to remind us, number one, Sunday morning, that we're focusing on God, knowing Him a bit better, and then reminding ourselves on this Sunday evening lessons that we're a church. We're a people of God. As we look at all the things that we're to be doing as a church, the outcome comes to that last point of the message, that we're a body of Christ. Jesus being our head, directing, guiding, and leading, everything is happening. And we're to become, as best we can, equipped as a unit, functioning together. Many times you'll attend assemblies where young children are learning to play instruments, and they're in a high school band or whatever, and some of them are fabulous out there. But at those beginning stages, when you're there and you're listening to the entire group playing together, they've all got their parts and they're working on it, and they're somewhat in harmony. But your parents or grandparents or your relatives in some sense are good friends, and so you'll listen to all that and you'll applaud it because you see their goal. Their goal is not just to play that little instrument, but their goal is to harmonize with the rest of the group to produce something. It's exactly what God's looking for with us. You see, we're not just doing our part, but we're doing our part in harmony with other people, coordinated for events and activities and functions and all the things that we do. This Wednesday, we have a speaker that's coming from Kenya. Never met him before. Has a good first name, it's David. John Ackerman said, how you pronounce that last name? I said, first name's David. You know, pretty well said, you know. Maybe it's my Ruby. It looks like it when I read it, but who knows. But he's going to tell us about a work that's going on in a distant country called Kenya. His conversion, maybe how things developed, I'm not sure of all that, and just relating what's going on. But he's part of the body, you see. Anytime we can get to listen to what people are doing around the world, it reminds us of how big and how great and how strong God's body really is. We begin to expand our thinking of what God intended. we allow ourselves maybe to dream a little bit about what we can do as individuals and remind ourselves in this whole process that the purpose is to have the church grow by strengthening individuals, to cause ourselves to remember what we're about and to function together in unity. In closing, I wanted to look at something that Peter talked about in 1 Peter. He's describing who we are, I guess, in the process of growing. Peter's an individual that I guess I identify with to the degree that he had his foot in his mouth quite often as an apostle, failed on occasion, stepped up and tried, and sometimes he did okay and sometimes he didn't. He was the individual that got out of the boat, but he was also the individual that sank when he tried to walk on water. But as he looks back and he begins to write, I think with a bit more experience and definitely with an inspiration from God, I think he speaks from his own life experiences as he encourages us to remember verse 1 of chapter 2, that we lay aside all malice and all deceit and all hypocrisy and all envy and all evil speaking. We put aside those things of the world. And as newborn babes, we desire the pure milk of the Word that we can grow thereby. There's that process that we're striving to nourish ourselves. And then he reminds them in verse 5 that as a group of people, they are living stones. They're being built up into a spiritual house, a holy priesthood. You see, those are all group words. They're not defining individuals, but rather what we do as a church. He starts out with talking about how we as individuals try to get rid of the things that keep us from doing what we need to do, and then make us understand that we function together. So we skip on down to verse 9. He says, "You are a chosen generation." Our psychologists spend a lot of time defining generations. They define baby boomers and I don't know all the different terms that come along the way in describing all these different people. Because as a whole, we do identify with certain characteristics and kind of run in groups and such. But here's what God says about us. As an individual, as people who gather together on Sunday night, Sunday morning, separate from the world and all these other generic descriptions that the world gives to us, this is who we are. A chosen generation. That God is watching what's going on in this congregation. This is my people. This is my body. And I think, quite frankly, that God's proud about what we do. And the efforts that we make as a church in reaching out on this campus, downtown, Pedaputi, India, wherever it might be, that God says, that's my generation. It causes us to remind ourselves of not only who we are, but what we're about as a royal priesthood, a holy nation, His own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of Him who called you out of darkness and into His marvelous light. As a body, that's what we're up to. Reminding ourselves of, as individuals, what we get rid of, strengthen ourselves in teamwork together, reminding ourselves that our focus is the body, not being disabled by all these things that we might get tied up with, and rather remind ourselves that I'm not important, the body's important. And I'm going to keep that and keep going at that. That's a start. We'll come back next week and we'll look at chapter 1, Lord willing, in a little more detail, about some details and divisions, and discuss it maybe in a little more general perspectives, but focus a little more detail than that. But tonight, as you look at yourself and think about what Peter said here on the things that we need to lay aside, have you laid those aside? Because if you haven't, it's like part of our body that's hurting, and the rest of the body can't function because there's a part of the body that's cancerous and hurting and wounded and beat up, and it's not able to do what it needs to do, and the rest of the body's taking up for it as best it can, but it still needs some attention. And as individuals, we as individuals have to put our efforts to be what we ought to be, so the body can be what it needs to be. So I'm not only disabling myself if I'm not living with God, working with Him, doing what I ought to do, but I'm holding back an extremely important work of God's kingdom that needs to march forward. The venture is doubly important. Christ being our head guides us, directs us. If you're not serving, you're not living faithful. Then step out. Be strong. Start over. If you've never made a commitment to Christ, again, going back to that emphasis about the body and becoming a Christian, Romans chapter 6, Paul talks about us being buried with Christ in baptism. We're connected to Him, to the body, through the action of baptism. If you're ready to repent of your sins, and we're ready to help you to make that decision tonight. Tonight. Not tomorrow, don't wait. Tonight. Scripture says today is the day of salvation. Satan says tomorrow. Wait till tomorrow. He'll keep having you wait. And God keeps saying today. Today. If your life isn't right, get right today while we stand and sing.